Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Philosophy of in Eastern Europe podcast brought to you by the European Center for Philosophy of Culture. We would like to re-examine Eastern Europe from a philosophical perspective.
One can say that, given the current geopolitical and geocultural circumstances, this question was never more important than it is now. So, what is Eastern Europe? Where is it located? What are its distinctive axiological and normative characteristics? What is its significance for the European cultural project?
It seems that one of the essential characteristics of genuine philosophy is that it functions in a tension with the political power. Philosophy ought to be, at least to some extent, subversive and anarchic, not in a sense of a specific political program, but as a relentless effort of questioning the fundaments of political power and its sources of legitimization. The political power, in turn, responds with efforts to subordinate philosophy, to make it a political instrument. In short, to turn it into ideology. In the totalitarian and semi-totalitarian regimes, this strategy not only takes on the most visible forms, but even more importantly, these regimes are openly hostile to all forms of independent thinking. This hostility takes form of oppression, ranging from refusing thinkers their place in academia, to exile, to imprisonment, or declaration of insanity, up to physical elimination in the most drastic cases. Of course, these phenomena are not limited to the mentioned regimes. We all know very well the foundational story of the Western philosophy, that of Socrates. And yet, it seems that it was Eastern Europe during the communist times where the scale, intensity, and systemic character of oppression of philosophy and philosophers were truly spectacular. In this episode, we are to talk about how philosophy in Eastern Europe responded to this condition of functioning under oppression. Our guest today is Professor Laurynas Peluritis from the Faculty of Philosophy, Vilnius University, a great social and political philosopher, historian of concepts and ideas, a great expert in the history of Lithuanian philosophy, especially in the times of Soviet occupation. And he kindly agreed to be our guest for the second time. So, welcome.
Hello. It's a great pleasure to be here in Warsaw, and it's a great pleasure to talk with you all.
Okay. Laurynas, let me start with a very, very general question. I would say transhistorical, in a sense, question. What exactly makes philosophy a special target of the political regimes? What is it about philosophy that it appears dangerous for the political power? If we go back to the ancient Greece, then we have this famous characteristic of a philosopher as atopos, out of place. This can obviously raise some suspicions about such a persona, but it does not necessarily mean that he or she poses a special risk to political power. Referring to Socrates, it is certainly true that he challenged social circles of his polis. However, at the same time, he certainly didn't mean to undermine the legality of the political power.
Well, it's a very good question, and I think it is transhistorical in the sense that many philosophers face the same issue or the same challenges. On the one hand, I think why philosophy is conceived as dangerous or as risky by those in places of power is that, well, philosophy never stops to ask. There's no limit to philosophy, and philosophers are always tempted to go further in, question further, dig deeper, and there's never a satisfactory answer. And in political praxis and pragmatics, what we sort of tend to look for is a certain limit where we stop questioning, where we just act. There's no time, no space for reflection. And sometimes, if we would remember our colleagues and friends who are now fighting in Ukraine against Russian imperial aggression or supporting that fight close to the front lines, it's exactly this kind of existential situation. There's no time to reflect very often. You just have to be in the moment. But also we see with them, they still reflect. They still come and share their ideas with us. Big greetings to Volodymyr Yermolenko.
Of course, our great friend.
Yes, and a great philosopher, I think, of our time in many ways. So, but I think this element of philosophy that it always moves further, there is no fixed limit, is why philosophy is perceived as dangerous. But another big element for me is, again, the Socratic question: what is my duty? What is my duty to my fellow citizens? What is my duty to the truth? And philosophers, as I've seen as a historian of philosophy, are usually those kinds of people who feel, a sense of a very strong sense of duty and calling to do what they do, because they think that this is paramount. These things are the most important things to do with your life. And I think this kind of sense of mission also creates this danger, even though you might not be asking directly political questions. The fact that you're, even questioning certain elements of everyday beliefs, for a lot of people, especially close-minded people, that can be very unsettling. For example, questioning aesthetic ideas or tastes of the time can be perceived even as a bigger affront to society or public order than that of direct political debate. But here again, I think of Plato when of course, he's idealizing Socrates in many ways. The paradigmical image of Socrates that we have is a very idealized version. But I think this idealized version is the sort of the paradigm itself. It doesn't really now matter if this was really Socrates or Plato, just with his genius and cleverness, created something more than just the historical Socrates. But to quote also a great Polish philosopher, Leszek Kolakowski, if you're not seeing yourself as part of this tradition that starts with Socrates, you're not part of Western philosophical tradition. That's, I think, in the metaphysical horror, he begins with this idea. And I strongly feel that all the philosophers in our philosophical tradition who have faced censorship, repression, existential challenges, they kind of find a little bit of solace in Socrates as this great martyr of philosophy. Not that we believe in somehow that he's protecting us as a saint of philosophy from somewhere, but we find great encouragement in his example, exactly as a paradigm of what a philosopher must do.
Mm-hmm. I fully agree with what you said. Let me follow with another general question, which I believe is quite relevant to the main topic of our conversation. One of the dangers inherent to philosophy is its ideologization. If we follow a classical but obviously oversimplistic definition of ideology by Karl Marx, then it is quite simple to identify this risk and to look for possible remedies, even if one is not a thinker of Marxist provenance. But things get a bit more complicated if we turn affirmatively towards these conceptions of ideology, which underscores the ideological character of the whole of cultural reality, like, for example, Althusser, the proponents of the critical and representatives of the critical theory, Paul Ricoeur, Clifford Geertz, to use the example from outside philosophy per se, and more recently Slavoj Žižek, for example. Where does the line of demarcation between philosophy and ideology lie? And can philosophy avoid the trap of ideologization?
It's a very good question in the sense that it's very hard to give a good definition of what philosophy is, and very hard to then give a definition of what ideology is. And if you start answering the question, what is philosophy, it's usually a very nice book written by a philosopher. Then that's the end result of it. But I think if we look a little bit historically and to see where the danger lies in ideology, first appears sort of the end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century, as this term to describe an attempt of a science of ideas. Like geography is a science of spatial, natural features of the earth, and so ideology would be something similar. But very quickly, already we know that Napoleon already uses it as a pejorative, of course, to humanitarians and social sciences, saying, well, these people who are doing natural sciences, they're scientists, and these people who are doing research into what the human is or what society is, etc., they're ideologues. And I think this pejorative term was maybe not earned at the time, but what Marx really does, and we find in a few places, of course, it's German ideology by him and Friedrich Engels, but also in his private correspondences where he sort of presents that falsches Bewusstsein, the false consciousness idea. But if we read just in the published text of German ideology, we would see that the metaphor of camera obscura, that ideology is a kind of reflection of the reality that we live in, but in the case of German bourgeois ideology, it's a sort of upside-down version. And the mission then of the critique of ideology, the task of critiquing ideology is then, again, turning it from its head and setting it in its right place, seeing things as they are. But I think here, Marx isn't the first philosopher to say this. I mean, if, again, return to the tradition of Plato, or we then look at Descartes and many others who are always asking this, what is reality? What is the truth? How can we know certain things? Are we not mistaking? Are we being fooled somehow by some evil deceiver, etc.? And I think Marx really goes in this tradition really well if we contextualize him like this. So this critical aspect of any kind of philosophy or any kind of social critique is of course important. But what the post-Marxist sense of ideology is, I think, kind of twofold. One is that exactly we kind of talk of ideology as this false consciousness, this somehow hiding, distorting things. But another use of the term is very clearly what we could say a shorthand of ideas. So basically, like if we say, I don't know, Christian democratic ideology or conservative or liberal, neoliberal ideology, would mean basically a simplified set of ideas which are not to be examined further, which are not to be reflected further. They're already a kind of set of answers that you use as a toolbox. And of course, especially for people who are in politics, in the public sphere, it's then a lot easier not ask fundamental questions, but to have a basic toolkit of answers. And so we have this double sense of the word ideology. And a very funny thing happens with Marxist ideology in the Soviet Union. If we would study how the term is used, we would find that, for example, for Lenin, the term ideology was not a pejorative. He wasn't a great follower of Marx on this question, and he was just saying, well, the Bolshevik ideologies or the communist ideologies, as in this kind of very positive sense, that this is a distilled, formulated, weaponized version of thought that is used to mobilize the masses, to have, their professional revolutionary party, etc., etc. And later on, if we would look at how the sort of Marxist-Leninist doctrine is first set in the Stalinist era in the 1930s, there's again this duality. They say, well, there's Marxist ideology and then there's bourgeois ideology. And bourgeois ideology, of course, it has all these components as a false consciousness, etc., but then they use it as well to describe Marxist ideas. And even if you would look Stalin's authorized text on dialectic and historical materialism, you would find that he kind of describes ideology as just all cultural non-material phenomena kind of go in this way of the realm of ideological questions. So it's not, again, a very critical term. But, of course, then Soviet Marxism is kind of this peculiar position. How do you explain that one ideology is great and all the other ideologies are bad and evil? And well, it gives a kind of very funny answer that says, well, our ideology is based on science. It's a scientific ideology. And then it's a sort of, we don't choose our values, etc., based on a certain axiological sort of outlook on the questions, what are the right things to seek. No, they kind of deny the ought and is distinction, used by philosophers like Hume, etc., and saying, well, we are saying that communism is the best goal because it is a scientific goal. And that's why our ideology is a great one, because it's based on science. A very, of course, peculiar understanding of science, but nevertheless. So I think this kind of creates Soviet ideology as a very strange example. But then, if we would look at Soviet ideology as a concrete example, I think it really helps to understand where the differences lie and where the dangers for philosophy are. Because such ideological systems, like total ideological systems, they kind of want to take the place of philosophy. So in discourse, you can see that the term philosophy and Marxism-Leninism is used as a synonym. So if you're saying philosophy, it means Marxism-Leninism. If you're saying Marxism-Leninism, of course, it's the only philosophy in town, especially during like the Stalinist and later eras also to a large extent. But there's also this element that you cannot ask then certain questions. You can only think and be creative inside a very certain framework. And if you would read a lot of sort of post-Stalinist era Soviet Marxists who are trying to bring in sort of reconcile materialism and idealism, like Evaldin Ilyankov was trying to do, or try to reconcile Marxist-Leninist vision of philosophy of science as presented in Marxism and empirio-criticism, with a sort of neo-positivist outlook of the scientific process and etc. And so, like, people like Pavel Kopnin were doing a sort of version of red neo-positivism, we can say. And so, but they were, of course, well, rather for the context of the Soviet Union, rather well-educated and clever guys, but they were thinking inside a very particular framework. They were not allowed to step outside it. And I think this kind of distinction separates ideology and philosophy. Philosophy doesn't have a credo that you say that, well, I believe in the Communist Party or whichever party to be the only leader for humanity, etc., blah, blah, blah. So philosophy doesn't admit these kinds of things. So this is the big distinction. But where the similarities are is exactly with these total ideological systems, is that they kind of try to take the place of philosophy as giving answers to all the fundamental questions. What is reality? What is history? What is the human life all about? What's the meaning? What a human person is?
That's the ultimate
yeah,
answers.
yeah, exactly. But it kind of tries to take philosophy's place, and it positions itself as a pinnacle of philosophy. If you would remember how sort of the ideological theory of Marxism-Leninism would present itself, it would present itself in a very kind of Hegelian fashion, that we had progressive and regressive philosophy, idealism and materialism, dialectical and non-dialectical, etc. And then we have this kind of a progressive philosophy, which is also materialistic and dialectical, and it sort of connects all these elements, and that's why it's the best philosophy. And so it takes philosophy's place as a form of ultimate answers. So, but I think here structurally already we can see this similarity between certain ideology and philosophy, and also when you interpret texts from that time, it's very sometimes hard to distinguish what's the genre, in what kind of category can you place this text or author. Is it ideology, or is it the philosopher who's playing with ideological themes, etc.? These are very difficult interpretive questions as well.
I think it's time to more contextualize our, although you already started to contextualize our conversation. Some time ago, you wrote an excellent dissertation on Lithuanian philosophy in times of Soviet Union. I had a chance to read a kind of summary of that. In its title, you used two very significant metaphors: the sun, the cave, and two suns. What these metaphors say about the condition of Lithuanian philosophy in times of oppression? What exact challenges it had to confront? What strategies of survival had it to or could it implement? And how would you compare the Lithuanian philosophical landscape of those times with the situation in other countries of the region? I know it's a bunch of the question, but I believe they are significantly interrelated.
Yes, of course. But I'll start maybe with the last part of the question of how Lithuania compares. Well, of course, if we would think of Lithuania at the end of World War II, it's in a very, very difficult condition, because in 1940 we were occupied by the Soviet Union, then in 1941 by Nazi Germany, then in 1944-45 again by the Soviet Union. And each of these occupations, they gave a wave of violence, of repressions. Especially the Soviet repressions were aimed at, first and foremost, the sort of intelligentsia, the most educated and brightest of our country. But also we must never forget what Nazis and their local collaborators did in Lithuania as well. So it's more than 95% probably of the Lithuanian Jewish community was killed and ceased to exist. And with that, a very bright, vibrant culture, and many young philosophy students, and for example, the family of Emmanuel Levinas, who was killed in Kaunas. And this is the history we must never forget about. So, and after Nazi Germany, of course, then again came the Soviet Union, a lot of repressions, and where it left Lithuanian sort of intellectual life was in a very dark place. That a lot of people had either died during the war, many of sort of younger intellectuals and philosophers fled to the West and ended up in Germany, in Canada, United States, and many other places. And very few were left in Lithuania of the especially older philosophers. I would name basically just two people left. Funnily enough, both of them aren't Lithuanian, but there was Lev Karsavin, a philosopher and historian, and also rather famous. And he was a very important figure in Lithuania intellectually during the interwar years. He still remained to teach at Vilnius University up until 1947. We also then look at another great philosopher, Vasily Sezaman, who's a sort of Finnish, German, Russian-speaking, and kind of this mix of traditions and cultures, who also moved to Lithuania in the interwar years, learned the language, started teaching here, and he was a kind of a phenomenologist of not the Husserlian side, but more akin to Nikolai Hartmann and that kind of approach to phenomenological philosophy. And so that was basically it. And then the rest of people who were calling themselves philosophers were either Marxists who were imported from other Soviet republics, or local Marxists who kind of became philosophers very quickly. One day you're a red partisan, the next day you're a philosophy professor, and you teach Stalin's texts and whatnot. So it's kind of, there were people who made a very, very quick career. But also Lithuania was directly incorporated into the Soviet Union. So that makes a kind of difference of autonomy, especially if we would look at other countries close by, like Poland, etc., that was later on a big intellectual resource for Lithuanian intellectuals during the Soviet period, because the press was freer, there was a lot more going on culturally, and it was still more open in many regards. And so the Lithuanian philosophical scene was very much decimated, and sort of teaching of philosophy the way it was previously was discontinued. Even those like Vasily Sezaman taught up until 1949 at Vilnius University, he then was fired, he was arrested, he was sent off to the gulags, but unlike Lev Karsavin, he returned, and after his return he was even rehabilitated, and he then returned to teaching logic and aesthetics in Vilnius University and other schools, but of higher education. But he didn't kind of actively oppose or challenge the Soviet ideology. He was very careful about it, etc. But he was kind of the last people who were still presenting a very different philosophical tradition. And what happens later on, and he dies in the early 1960s, so there's no direct sort of philosophical impact of sort of his interpretation of phenomenology that would be continued. A later generation that sort of comes into the universities to study and to later on write and teach in the late 60s, early 70s, they kind of have to learn everything for themselves. So they sort of start reading the literature that was available to them. Of course, again, the libraries were very much restrictive in what kind of books they possessed, because there was, especially in the start of the occupation, was huge cleansings of library book deposits, etc. And a lot of literature was hidden away in what's called the special deposits that you couldn't access without a certain kind of permit, etc., etc. So this was kind of a very challenging situation, but people who were interested in philosophy emerged, and they started reading about Heidegger, they started reading about Camus, Sartre, existentialism, and also philosophy of science as done by Rudolf Carnap or Popper, etc. So it's kind of these self-taught philosophers emerge. Of course, bigger centers like Moscow and Leningrad also played a factor in the sense that study of bourgeois philosophy was, especially from the 1970s, was a lot more open and less restrictive than on sort of the imperial periphery. And so philosophy kind of emerged through these people again on its own, people who taught themselves, etc. And this is very important to notice, that if you just leave just enough breathing space for people with a curious mind, they will find philosophy and philosophy will find them. And you can ask follow-up questions, but then returning to the beginning of your question on my dissertation and why it's called The Cave and Two Suns, I was kind of thinking that a lot of the question of how Lithuanian philosophy and a more general and a more genuine embracement of the Western philosophical tradition, how it happened, it's a kind of a story of awakening, and sort of this. If we remember the analogy of the cave as presented by Plato, sort of you leave the cave and you see how not only the cave is arranged, but also what is the outside world really. But then you have to return and do something about it. And so it's a kind of a story of the prisoners of the cave who awake from this horrible nightmare, and they kind of then try to find their way out of there. And some of them did that rather successfully. But the question of two sons, well, it pertains to our first question, the relation between ideology and philosophy. And of course, if we remember Plato, the thing you see is the good, the idea of the good, or you see the sun when you go out of the cave. And also, if we would remember the analogy of the sun and the divided line, sort of that's the goal where we want to go. You're sort of having the ability to contemplate the realm of ideas. But there's this myth or sort of ideological creation that happened when Lithuania was first occupied in 1940. A delegation of sort of left-leaning intelligentsia, writers, poets, went to Moscow and then returned to Lithuania, bringing back with them Stalin's son. So I kind of really thought about the existential situation about philosophy and philosophers. And then, for Plato, the sun is very much one thing. It illuminates all things
It has to be a one thing.
Yes, but it illuminates everything we think of. It illuminates everything we can understand with our mind. And this ideology kind of promises a very similar thing, that if you awaken to this ideological seeing of the world, then you have you change philosophy with ideology. And I think also if you would read what intellectuals like Czesław Miłosz was writing in The Captive Mind, which I think is still a very important and a great book in the way it describes how intellectual compromise can become sort of intellectual corruption of oneself, but also that moment of almost religious belief that certain people experience a moment of conversion, that they believe in the ideology. But also, again, returning to Leszek Kolakowski and other critics of Marxism, even from Marxist points of view, we can see that it's also then this duality of the mind. Later on, it still kind of creeps back. You believe and don't believe at the same time, and it's also disintegrating and corrupting you as a human person. And I remember just one last final touch on that. I was at a seminar in Lithuania which was talking about sort of Soviet intelligentsia and philosophers during the Soviet occupation, etc. And there was a lot of apologetics that of course, we were making compromises, but it was for the good, and we knew the ideology was fake, but we kind of went along with it to do certain things that we wanted to do. And in the end, as we see, it sort of had a happy ending. So it kind of, this teleology of events then kind of justifies the previous actions. But one really old fella who is a philosopher, and he's been working in philosophical publishing for more than 50 years. The guy is, I won't mention his name because for an international audience it's not that important, but he's a very good-spirited 90-something-year-old lover of philosophy. And he stands up and he says, well, what was a philosopher during the Soviet? What it was like? Who was a philosopher during the Soviet occupation? And he said, well, it was someone who engaged in compromise. And he didn't mean it neither as something as pejorative or apologetic, but he kind of described his own situation. He says, now reading Miłosz and others on that sort of those conditions of living in this totalitarian ideological state, he says, I understand that what we did when we publicly admitted, well, that of course the Communist Party is so great, and of course we believe in the shining bright future of socialism and communism, etc. He said the damage that we did was twofold. One thing, it was demoralizing for society. Seeing these smart, best of the best people publicly saying this nonsense, it's demoralizing. But it's one thing. But the far worse element of that is the damage that left to one's soul, that you are disingenuous in what you say, and it was a very poignant moment. I'm not a person to judge these people, but I think it's very important to reflect that, and again to remind yourself that very few of us are probably going to be this great Socratic figure. But if you would think about Lithuanian philosophy during the Soviet period, we didn't have a philosophical martyr like Jan Patočka. And it's it has to be said that we had philosophers, of course, or people who were studying philosophy and by the late Soviet period were criticizing the ideology and deconstructing all its elements, etc. But we didn't have these kinds of martyrs that would, abandon everything and.
But I believe in Poland we also don't have such a spectacular examples like Socratic examples. But what about the other forms of oppression, like exile? refusal to take a place in academia, closing academias, because probably you remember that in 1968, the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Warsaw, as an effect of the events of March 1968, precisely, was closed, was shut off, and subordinated to probably the most ideological part of the University of Warsaw, which was the Institute of Political Sciences. Was this kind of examples common in Lithuania?
Well,
I'm asking generally about different forms. What was the range of forms of oppression?
Well, in Lithuania, the case was that already in the first decade, the repressions were so severe and so decimating. We didn't have this kind of revisionist, even Marxism, appearing in the late 60s. So we didn't have this big crackdown, but we had certain examples, and I'll talk about them in a second. But of course, a lot of the philosophical texts in Lithuanian, which I would consider worthy of something and truly interesting, were written by philosophers who left by the end of World War II, or as in the case of Vasily Sezaman, he just left a lot of manuscripts, which are now being studied by my older colleague Dalius Jonkus, and he's writing also in Lithuanian and in English about sort of his various notebooks and studies into aesthetics, logic, metaphysics, even from the point of view of phenomenological philosophy, etc. So, but in the public sphere, nothing challenging from the field of philosophy appeared. But what the process that we did have was this sort of gradual warming, which happened even in spite of those crackdowns or that happened after 1968. Like if we would talk about culture in the Soviet Union and occupied Soviet republics, in the late 60s, early 70s, it's usually the term that uses the sort of stagnation of Brezhnev, the sort of the thaw of Khrushchev has now been not only ended, but also there's this violent crackdown on all dissidents, repressions increase. Of course, they're not mass repressions as they used to be, but targeted, but still rather significant. Like a lot of young students, intellectuals end up in psychiatric hospitals, etc. So there's a lot of these things going. Censorship ramps up, and there's this sort of course, increased spending on the state security apparatus, the KGB, etc., and all the activities that they do, and so and various forms of censorship. But what also happens, of course, there's then the reaction to it, various forms of self-censorship, that you are too afraid to write something, too afraid to say something, you're very careful, you're tiptoeing around certain issues, etc., or you're looking for certain backing from maybe some higher-ups in Moscow who can be your sort of patrons if you confront local sort of authorities, ideological or and things like that. So, for example, if you would look at the state of philosophical publications and writings in Lithuania in the late 60s, early 70s, we slowly begin to publish on and translate Western philosophical classical texts. So we have excerpts published in a periodical philosophical journal. So we get Husserl, Russell, kind of 19th century, early 20th century philosophy reappears as bourgeois philosophy. Then we have a slow, gradual interest through the classics department with ancient philosophy. So we get, again, a republication of Plato's dialogues, which were published in the interwar years. It's actually in 1968, and it's a pretty big cultural event. Everyone is reading, and there's even plays in the theater which enact, certain parts of those dialogues, etc. So, these are slowly bringing back into the Lithuanian cultural tradition Western philosophy. Of course, in the exile, all philosophers are reading and writing about everything. It's a very different story. We're not talking about that now. But also, the criteria very much was, what's happening in Moscow. If a book is published in Russian, then you can go to the censors at Glavlit and say, well, it's been published in Russia, it's been published in Moscow, so why not publish it in Lithuania? And they say, kind of hard to disagree there. Another big element then is what I mentioned earlier, these young people who enter academia and start to study philosophy by themselves because they enter not from ideological positions. They don't have a party career which then turns you into a professor. They have to kind of earn it on merit. They have to just prove their chops in the way they write, in the way they think, etc. Of course, they have to pay lip service to the Soviet ideology, etc. But slowly, over the 70s, we have this growing number of publications on and translations of classical Western philosophy, and people start studying, Heidegger. He's very big. Everyone's interested in existentialism. Through that, they start to discover phenomenology, Husserl, etc. So it kind of broadens as we move to the late 80s. We then kind of can fairly say that we have a reestablished reception, at least, of main philosophical non-Marxist traditions in the West, the continental and the analytical one.
That's fascinating. You already briefly touched upon that, but I'm going to ask you to expand a little bit on the two moments you mentioned. Because while thinking about philosophy in Eastern Europe in the communist times, two very interesting phenomena comes immediately to my mind. Obviously, there are many interesting phenomena concerning these times and philosophy, but when it comes, speaking for myself, first, the changing attitude towards Marxism. And the second, a very significant role played by phenomenology. So with regard to the former, when it comes to Poland, for example, the first period after Second World War was largely comparable, as I believe, to what took place in Lithuania and other parts of the Soviet Union belonging to Eastern Europe. I mean, the other two Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine. That is the dominance of highly ideologized form of Marxism-Leninism. But then in the next phase in Poland, that is after 1956, there was a very strong revisionist movement within Marxism, represented by many notable Polish thinkers, just to mention Leszek Kołakowski, whom you mentioned a couple of times. The whole idea was to return to young Marx as a representative of the great tradition of the European humanism. A thinker whose work can inspire a positive cultural reconstruction and in this way lead to the so-called communism with the human face. Was there any space for such a phenomenon in Lithuania or in other Soviet republics? Mainly those which I mentioned.
Well, it's a very, very interesting subject, and if we would look at the perception of Marx, that really changes in the Soviet Union. If you would look in 1956 or 58, that Marx's early philosophical writings were published in Russian. In Lithuania, we have that only in the very early 80s. And the very big distinction being that it was translated not by the ideological translators who were responsible for translating the sort of ideological dogma texts. It was translated by philosophy translators and commented by philosophers. But this duality certainly appears even in interpretations of Soviet Marxism in Lithuania, especially with the sort of younger post-Stalinist generation of I wouldn't say Marxist philosophers, but certainly Marxist theoreticians. And there is this increased interest into the problems of alienation, so that and it kind of a lot of younger Marxists are interested in looking for connections with the existential currents in Western philosophy. Some of them I know even from Lithuania attend the Korčula summer seminars in Yugoslavia, etc. So there's this kind of engagement with revisionist Marxism going on, but no one ever steps over the line to become a revisionist. So there's an increased element of what you say, sort of the social sphere, the sort of the soft factors, not the hard materialism, determinism, but sort of things that are more subtle. Or people interested in how ideals relate to materia, etc., trying to expand what Soviet Marxism is about. But of course, we don't have this kind of revisionist turn, and I think because these people are also very careful. If we would think the bigger danger from the standpoint of view of the Soviet system would have been, it's not the outer enemy, the capitalists, the bourgeois, philosophers, etc. It's the inner factions, the potential for ideological schisma. A revisionist is much. I would say that. So in a Russian context, it would be very adequate to see an enemy is one thing, but a traitor is much worse. And revisionists, for the sort of orthodox Soviet Marxists, they are traitors. Yeah. They are to be eliminated and destroyed. And so if you would look at how sort of party ideologue Marxists react to any kind of more nuanced and broader interpretations of Marxism, they're very suspicious and very closely watching those who try to, interpret Soviet Marxism not so stupidly, you could say. But an opposite question then can be asked about these people who are in Lithuania, for example, who are creating these kind of more nuanced versions of Soviet Marxism and its interpretation. Mm-hmm. Because, if you would read textbooks, it's a kind of nonsense philosophy by the 50s and 60s. And they try to make some kind of sense out of it. But then, again, what are they doing? Are they kind of being critical and opening up are helping to open up the discourse, or are they just trying to save this failed ideological project? And I kind of agree both with Kolakowski and Andrzej Walitsky in the sense that when Kolakowski says in his Main Currents of Marxism that sort of the Stalinist ideological system was the last period when we could consider the Soviet ideology to be sort of this holistic, all-encompassing. But what Walitsky later on, sort of in writing in the early 90s, when he's writing about Soviet Marxism and its history after this kind of Stalinist period and how it transitions both ideologically and politically, he kind of notices that with Khrushchev and this kind of socialism with the human face, etc., there is this one final push to still believing in this ideology and in these ideas. And if I look at how the sort of philosophical discourse is controlled during this period, you would think that Khrushchev's phone would be a period of more freedom in terms of discussing various topics, even in narrow confines. No, it's a double down on ideology and ideological text. That, for example, students shouldn't read philosophical essays by Einstein on his theory of relativity in the context of scientific philosophy. No, just Lenin and Marxism and empirical criticism is enough. So it's a sort of a crackdown, but with the sort of Brezhnev stagnation, it's a kind of a giving up. We kind of consolidate our positions of power, and then you can engage with bourgeois philosophy, you can read it, providing that you're critical of it. So that if you write critical texts about bourgeois philosophy, you're allowed to study it, to some extent teach it, etc., etc. So it kind of goes into this schizophrenic compromise when the ideology, where this cynicism appears really. People really stop believing in this idea. And I think I agree with them both, because I think they kind of, Kolakowski and Walitsky here, complement each other, even though it doesn't sound that way at first glance, but if you look at the sort of cultural and political process underneath, I would agree with them both here.
Our time is coming, is slowly ending, but I'm still tempted to pose a question about phenomenology. I believe that with this regard there are at least 3 points to be made when it comes to the status of phenomenology in our region in those times. The first point is that in Lithuanian context, and also to some extent in Polish as well, through most of the communist times, phenomenology, especially in its Husserlian form, was treated as a kind of this disgusted bourgeois philosophy. That's the first point. But there is also another point, which says something like its status was neutral, as far as phenomenologists were not concerned with social political issues. And here I believe the very good example is the more or less uncontested status of Roman Ingarden in Poland, who was mostly concerned with ontological and aesthetic issues. And the third point, in Polish context, there were some interesting examples of connecting Marxism with phenomenology, like philosophy of work by Jan Szewczyk, a very important figure for our friend Jan Molina. However, a really interesting phenomenon, in my view, was a reception of Heidegger's version of phenomenology, which took place parallelly in the whole region in 1970s and 1980s. Krzysztof Michalski, one of the initiators of the Polish reception of Heidegger's philosophy, wrote in the preface to the second edition of his book, initially published in 1978, that Heidegger's thought was for him and for his generation an antidote for the Hegelian bite, which for such a long time was turning faces full of life into the bloated faces of the apparatchiks. In other words, it has a kind of force liberating from the iron laws of history. How do you see the role and the status of phenomenology for Lithuanian philosophy and more broadly for the philosophy in Eastern Europe? What was so specific? What is so specific about this particular philosophical current that it made it so special for historical, cultural reality of our region?
It's a very complex issue that I don't yet have a satisfactory answer to. I've written about it to some extent, but I think there is an element in what you mentioned in that phenomenology was seen as sort of unpolitical. That it's, well, and of course, even if you would look at texts that I'll briefly return to the previous question of what was published. So the first text of political philosophy in Lithuanian to be published, of non-Marxist political philosophy, was Plato's Republic, and it was in 1985, like very late. So and all the sort of political philosophical texts were considered to be somewhat dangerous. And phenomenological philosophy kind of flies under the radar here. But I think that's the strength also of the phenomenological tradition, and why it's so sort of persistent to various in various hostile environments, and why it's immune to ideological manipulation. It's because it asks these fundamental questions about what is consciousness, what is knowledge, how do I or we know something, and in a very deep way. This multi-layered philosophy of reflection is, of course, an antidote to ideological thinking and ideological dogma. It cannot be otherwise. I think this element of phenomenology, which at the heart of it is here having this explosive potentiality. But in many places, phenomenology is, of course, discovered first and foremost through Heidegger. And already I know in the early 1970s, even sort of more liberal Marxist philosophers in Lithuania already they knew something about Heidegger. And also, well, in Lithuania, like during the interwar years and even during World War II, there were seminars on Heidegger. So there was some knowledge and etc. But I've traced, how philosophers from exile would send in Heidegger's Sein Zeit to Lithuania to at least to arrive to be read in the special deposit of the Academy of Science Library, etc. So it kind of starts to exist in culture, and it's seen as something that you somehow, as a cult philosopher, you could say, the Heidegger is the big one. That's a very tremendous sense. But I don't think it's only in our region. I think in very many places around Europe, starting from the 60s onward, Heidegger is starting to be recognized as this one of the greats, even with these controversial biographical moments. We still have to deal with this guy. And so this kind of status helps him. And if we would look at Lithuanian philosophy, it sort of then approaches phenomenology through the Heideggerian perspective, a little bit later on discovering Merleau-Ponty and starting to read in more deeply into Husserl and to write and reflect on Husserlian phenomenology. But philosophers like Arvydas Šliogeris in Lithuania, writing in the late 70s and 80s, draws heavily on Heidegger, and what it produces, in my mind, is very important culturally for that period, because in one of the books where Šliogeris is interpreting paintings by Paul Cézanne, again following Heideggerian motifs, but also looking for his own language, and he's sort of looking for various concepts that would help unlock a different way of looking at the world, that wouldn't just say that, well, this is a bourgeois philosophy and it's a product of capitalist conditions and alienation caused by workers not owning their means of production, etc. Also, there's now discourse arriving that there is maybe alienation in the socialist society. Who knows? But what Šliogeris does in this small book on art and things, again, he's saying, what is philosophy? And if you would think all the previous decades before in Lithuania, philosophy, of course, is Marxism-Leninism, and philosophy in its best interpretation of Marxism-Leninism, the sort of dominant interpretation in Lithuanian academia, was a sort of a meta-science, a science of scientific methods. That's since philosophy historically has lost its object and it no longer contributes to scientific progress, what it can do, it can help science with methodology. It can sort of, again, this kind of positivistic or neo-positivistic idea connected with progressive Marxist and Soviet Marxist ideas, this kind of strange combination. It's kind of the dogma that is sort of what is philosophy. It's a methodology of sciences. What Schlager says, philosophy is interpretation. And it's one thing that people who are reading philosophy and who are reading Heidegger, they knew about this, of course, earlier. But saying it publicly is, a challenge to the existing paradigm. Even if you say it very softly, as he does there, it's a formulating of a different point of view of what philosophy is. And here is, I would agree, this liberating force of philosophy that helps in part to then dismantle the Soviet ideological system later on.
Okay, I think our time is unfortunately over. However, it would be really good and really nice to extend this discussion. Thank you very much, Laurynas, for extremely rich and interesting talk. And this concludes our next chapter of our podcast.